Hi there, this is Matt Heffernan. Welcome back to my channel. This is the 5th episode of my tutorial series on Z80 assembly language development, targeting the Sinclair ZX Spectrum to learn how to program a simple system starting at the very lowest level. If you haven't seen the first episode, I strongly encourage you to go back to my channel, and don't forget to subscribe and click the bell to be notified when the next episode comes out, and start this playlist from the beginning. So far in this series, we have learned the basics of assembly language and went over how to move data using all of the different addressing modes and branching and looping with conditional instructions. In most cases, conditions are set as a result of arithmetic operations, and the Z80, like most 8-bit processors, only has native support for addition and subtraction. In this episode, we will go over how all of the different addition and subtraction instructions work and how they affect the status flags. If you are coming from the 6502, you will quickly see that not only is the Z80 quite different in the way that it handles the status flags, but that it is also much more complex in terms of the many different ways arithmetic operations can be implemented. This is why we are devoting a whole episode just to basic arithmetic, instead of going into Boolean logic as well. That will be coming out in the next episode, so please subscribe and click the bell to be notified when that comes out. For now, let's get our pluses and minuses straight. Most high-level languages, like C, use an intuitive syntax for mathematical operations that goes all the way back to Fortran, which tried to make code look like standard equations. To set a value to be the sum of two other values subtracted by a third value, in C you just write out the equation using variable names and end the line with a semicolon, like you see here on the left. In Z80 assembly, we have to break this operation down into individual steps. Assuming that all of these variables are 8-bit integers, we can reference them using labels and load their values into registers. First, we load the value of bar into A, then copy it into B. Next, we load baz into A, and then store it in C. Finally, we load foo into A, and we are ready to actually do the arithmetic. First, we add B to A, then subtract C, and finally store the result in val. Just like in the C code, the input variables remain unchanged as all the math happened in the registers using the copied values. It seems pretty straightforward, but there's a lot going on under the surface, and those details become important when you're writing your code. The add instruction is pretty self-explanatory. It can do either an 8-bit or a 16-bit addition, adding the value of the second operand to the first. For 8-bit adds, the first operand can only be A, so the accumulator will contain the sum after the addition happens. The second operand can use a few different addressing modes, starting of course with register, where you can specify any of the general-purpose 8-bit registers, including A itself. If you have a value in memory that you want to add to A, you can use the register indirect mode with the address in HL. You can do indexed mode also, specifying an offset from the address in either of the index registers. Finally, you can simply do an immediate add of a hard-coded 8-bit value. So beyond this addition, what actually happens? Let's consider the true sum of the operation. Because we are adding two 8-bit values, the result may require up to 9 bits. So what gets stored in A needs to be only the lower 8 bits of the sum, which would be the same as taking the modulo 256 value. This means if the sum was 256, A would end up with 0, or a sum all the way up to 510 would result in 254 in A. Don't worry, you don't lose that high bit, as we will see soon. This instruction will result in setting new values to all of the status flags, starting with the S bit, which will be set if the resulting value in A is greater than 127. This means the highest bit is set, so it can now be interpreted as negative if you are treating the value in A as a signed 8-bit integer. The Z bit is set when the resulting value in A is 0. The H bit gets set when there is a carry from adding the lower nibbles, meaning that the sum of the lower nibbles from each operand is greater than 15. The PV bit is set to indicate an overflow, which means that the sum actually required a 9th bit to be expressed properly. The important thing to keep in mind is that overflow always interprets everything as signed, So that means that the sum of the values as signed 8-bit integers results in a value of less than negative 128 or greater than 127, which is the range for 2's complement 8-bit integers. In practice, this means that overflow can only happen if both operands have the same sign, meaning the same high bit value. The n bit is always cleared after every add, just to let you know that it happened. And finally, the c bit will take that 9th bit of the sum to carry into another operation. So that's a lot to keep track of, but generally you will only care about 1 or 2 of these flags, depending on what you need to do. To better illustrate all of these effects, let's take a look at some simple code. In the far left column, we see a sequence of instructions, just a bunch of loads and adds with A and B. For each instruction, we'll track what values are in A and B and the states of all the flags. After the first instruction, the decimal value 42 is loaded into A. If you interpret it as signed, it's still just 42, as it's below 128. We can also see that this is 2A in hex, which even more clearly shows that the high bit is clear, as the upper nibble is less than 8. At this point, B contains an unknown value, and none of the flags would be affected by the load, so they are all still unknown. In the next instruction, we load 220 into B. Of course, A and the flags are unaffected, but now B is 220, which could be interpreted as negative 36 when taken as signed. This is because that high bit is actually set, as clearly seen with the hex value of DC. When the upper nibble of the hex value is 8 or higher, that means the high bit is set, and the value may be treated as negative. We then do our first add, which could result in a sum of 262, but of course we can't fit that into 8 bits. So A will be left with a value of 6, as 262 mod 256 is 6. Of course, 6 is still just 6 when signed, and that makes a bit more sense when you do the signed sum of 42 and negative 36, which will just be 6, so this isn't an overflow, as we can see with PV now being clear. But we can also see that the C bit is set, as an unsigned addition would require a carry to the next operation, or at least a 9th bit. The rest of the bits are also set to known values now, with S clear as 6 is positive, Z clear because it's non-zero, and H is set because the lower nibbles of the registers were hex A and C, which required a carry into the upper nibble addition. Of course, as we will see for each add instruction, the N bit is cleared. Next, we repeat the add AB instruction. This time we added 220 to 6, getting 226 for an unsigned sum. If we interpret everything as signed, we got negative 30 by adding negative 36 to 6. This time the S bit is set as the signed result is negative, but the carry bit is clear now as the sum fits in A. H is still set as the lower nibbles were 6 and C, requiring a carry into the higher nibble. Then we do the same add one more time. Adding 220 to 226 results in 446, so A is left with just 190 and the carry bit is set again. But this still isn't an overflow, even though both A and B were negative when interpreted as signed. Adding negative 36 to negative 30 just gets us negative 66, which still fits comfortably in 8 bits as hex BE. Of course, as the result is negative, the S bit is still set. This time H is clear, as 2 plus hex C is just hex E. Now let's load 42 into B this time. So A and the flags are unchanged, and now B has 42 in it, whether you interpret it as unsigned or signed. Now let's add them again. 190 plus 42 gives us 232 as an unsigned value, which is the same as negative 24 signed, as the result of negative 66 plus 42. So there's no overflow or carry, but S is set because it's negative, and H is set for the needed carry on the lower nibble. Now we load 128 into B. This means that the signed value of B is now negative 128, putting it at the lower limit for 2's complement 8-bit. Then we add again. With a negative value already in A, Adding 128 is guaranteed to generate both a carry and an overflow. The unsigned sum would have been 360, causing the carry, whereas the signed sum would have been negative 132, which caused the overflow. Taking just the lower 8 bits leaves 104 in A, which, despite the overflow, is now a positive value, so S is clear. Let's load 42 into B again. The flags are preserved, and now we have two positive values, 104 and 42, so let's add them. The sum is 146, which is perfectly fine as an unsigned value, but it's too large to be signed, so we get another overflow and the S bit is set. H is set too, from the carry on the lower nibble. Let's do one more load, putting 110 into B. Now we have 146 and 110, which is another mixed sign situation, with 146 interpreted as negative 110. So now you can guess what will happen when we do one more add. That's right, A wraps around to 0. It's not an overflow because of the mixed signs, but it does result in a carry, as the unsigned sum would be 256. With a 0 result, we clear the S bit and set the Z bit, and the H bit is set as the carry started in the lower nibble. Now let's move on to subtraction. The sub instruction, unlike add, is strictly for 8-bit subtraction, and the result can only be in the accumulator, which will have the value of the single operand subtracted from it. This operand can be any of the operands that can be used for the second operand of an 8-bit add, including an immediate 8-bit value. Sub will calculate the difference of the value of the operand from the value of A, but this difference might not fit in 8 bits. So just like with add, we do a modulo 256 to get the lower 8 bits, and that's what ends up in A. If the new value in A can be interpreted as negative, the S bit is set. Again, the Z bit will be set if A ends up as 0, which is guaranteed if you do a sub A instruction, as anything minus itself is 0. The H bit will be set if the difference between the lower nibbles is negative, requiring a borrow from the upper nibble. PV is overflow again, with the bit being set if the sign difference is below negative 128 or above 127. N will always be set, letting you know the subtraction happened. And finally, the C bit will be set when the unsigned difference is negative, which could require a borrow in a subsequent operation, or act as the sign bit for a 9-bit 2's complement number. Let's go through another exercise like the last one, this time doing sub B instructions in between loading new values into B. But first, we need to initialize A, again with 42. And just like last time, the value of B and the flags are all still unknown, so we load 57 into B. Now we have 42 and 57, both positive values even when signed. The flags are still a mystery, so let's do our first subtraction. 42 minus 57 is negative 15, which is perfectly fine as a signed 8-bit value, but it will result in the carry bit being set to indicate that a borrow is required, and the unsigned value of the lower 8 bits of the difference is 241. As expected, the S bit is set because of the negative difference, and the N is set because this was a subtraction, and we can expect it to stay set through the remaining instructions. Now we'll do the subtraction one more time. An unsigned subtraction of 57 from 241 gives us 184, which is the same as negative 72 when signed. This is also expected, as negative 15 minus 57 is negative 72, so no overflow or carry, as everything fits. The S bit is still set because A is still negative, and now the H bit is set because the lower nibbles were 1 and 7, so a borrow is required from the upper nibble. Let's now make B 180, and that gives us 184 and 180 for unsigned values, or negative 72 and negative 76 for signed values. Now we can subtract them. And we get 4 because we did 184 minus 180, or negative 72 minus negative 76, which effectively would be the same as negative 72 plus 76, or 76 minus 72. And every way you look at it, the answer is 4. Now we just had a simple positive result, which didn't even require a half carry for 8 minus 4 in the lower nibbles, so only the n bit is set. Let's do another sub b. And we get a carry because we were trying to subtract 180 from 4 for the unsigned operation. A signed subtraction of 4 minus negative 76 gets us 80, which is the same as the lower 8 bits of the unsigned difference of a negative 176. But as the value in a itself is positive, the s bit is clear, and there still hasn't been any overflow, as the signed subtraction was again perfectly valid. Next we have another subtraction. 80 minus 180 gives us negative 100, of course, and the lower 8 bits is the same as the value 156 when unsigned. So we get a carry as expected, but we get an overflow too, even if the signed result matches the unsigned difference. It does not, however, match the signed difference, as 80 minus negative 76 is 156, which is too high for an 8-bit value. So this means that we also have the s-bit set, along with the h-bit from having to do 0 minus 4 for the lower nibble. This leaves only the z-bit clear, as that can't be set at the same time as the s-bit because 0 is always treated as a positive 2's complement integer. Hey, let's subtract one more time. 156 minus 180 is negative 24, and that's our signed value. But that triggers a carry. The signed operation was negative 100 minus negative 76, which also gives us negative 24, so no overflow. But the s-bit is set because it's negative. Now let's shake things up and load 110 into b. This gives us 232 and 110 for unsigned values, or negative 24 and 110 for signed values. Let's subtract them. 232 minus 110 is 122, so no carry this time. But negative 24 minus 110 is negative 134, so we have an overflow. We also get a half carry this time, as 8 minus hex e requires a borrow from the upper nibble. We have just one more value to load into b, 122. Now we have 122s across the board, unsigned and signed. So of course, we need to end with one more subtraction. And now a is back down to 0. This will finally set the z-bit and nothing else besides that n-bit, which indeed stayed set the whole time. So now we've seen how the carry bit is set by both addition and subtraction. But how is it used to implement carries and borrows? For addition, there is the ADC, or add with carry instruction. The only difference between ADC and add is that the value of the carry bit will be included in the addition for ADC. For 8-bit ADC, it also requires you to use A for the first operand, and the second operand can use all of the registers and modes that the add instruction can. The effects of an 8-bit ADC are also the same, with the exception of the inclusion of the C bit in the resulting sum. So if there was a carry from a previous operation, the sum will be 1 higher than the sum that you'd get from an add with the same operands. By teaming up add and ADC, you can do additions between numbers of any size. You just want to start with an add between the lowest bytes, and then ADCs between the successively higher bytes until you get through all of the bytes of both values. Here's an example of how you can use chained addition to put the sum of BC and DE into HL. First, you need to copy the value of C to A, and then add the value of E to it. Now we have the lower byte of the sum calculated, so we can go ahead and copy that to L. Then we move on to the high byte by first loading B into A, and then adding D with carry, as the first add may have generated a carry if that sum was over 255. Then we just copy the high byte of the complete sum in A into H, and we're done. The carry bit may still be set, and that would indicate that the total 17-bit sum was greater than the maximum 16-bit value of 65,535. For subtraction, we have subtract with carry, or SBC. Unlike sub, SBC can be used for both 8-bit and 16-bit subtraction, so you will need to specify A as the first operand for 8-bit use. The second operand will contain the value to add to A, and it can use all the same addressing modes as the sub operand. It can be any general-purpose 8-bit register, a byte in memory whose address is in HL, a byte in memory at an offset from the address in one of the index registers, or just an immediate 8-bit value. For SBC, the difference calculated is the value in A minus the value of the second operand minus the value of the C bit. This will effectively implement a borrow taken for a previous operation. The flags are all set the same way as they are for a sub instruction, including a new output value for the C bit based on the sign of the difference. You can chain 8-bit subtractions in the same way that you do with addition, starting with sub for the lowest byte of the difference and SBC for each higher byte. Now, to get the difference of DE from BC stored in HL, we use a very similar sequence of instructions. Again, we load C into A, then do a sub E to get the low byte of the difference, which we then copy to L. Then we load B into A and subtract D with carry in case a borrow is required for the sub, and get the high byte of the difference, which finally gets loaded into H. Now let's get back to the add instruction, but this time look at how it can also do 16-bit addition. Again, the value of the second operand is added into the first operand, but this time the first operand can be either HL or one of the index registers. The second operand can be BC, DE, the stack pointer, or the register used for the first operand. That means you can add HL to itself, but not to IX, for example. Now let's take another look at the example we did for chaining 8-bit additions, putting the sum of BC and DE in HL. By using a 16-bit add, we need only half the instructions. Like before, we need to copy the value in B, but this time into H. Then we go straight to copying C into L so that HL now has the same value as BC. Then we just do a single add to bring in DE and have the whole sum in HL right away. This code only took up 3 bytes and can be executed in just 19 t-states, compared to the 6 bytes and 24 t-states required for the chaining example. So all around it is a better option for 16-bit addition. However, the circumstances of your code may make chaining a better option, but this savings of space and time needs to be considered. The effects of a 16-bit add are quite a bit different from the 8-bit opcodes. The sum is still operand 1 plus operand 2, and it will be stored in operand 1. But now we need to have the lower 16 bits of the sum, so there will be an effective modulo of 65,536, which is one more than the maximum value of an unsigned 16-bit integer. The resulting state of the H bit is actually undefined, so there's no programmatic use for it. Just like any addition, the N bit will be cleared, and the carry flag is set when that sum exceeded the maximum value. As for the rest of the flags, they are unchanged, with their previous states preserved. This is important to keep in mind in case you want to test for a negative or zero sum. You will not be able to use these flags as you would for an 8-bit addition. For sign, you will need to test the high bit of the high register, and for zero, you will have to check each byte individually. As for parity or overflow, you'll need to figure that out on your own if you need to. Requiring these extra operations to test the result of the add may cancel out the space and time savings of doing the 16-bit operation in the first place. ADC can be 16-bit as well, but it is different in some key ways. Of course, the value of the C bit is included in the sum, but the first operand must be HL. The index registers are not supported. Otherwise, the effects of the instruction are the same as the 16-bit add. So you can chain 16-bit additions by taking 2 bytes at a time, starting with add for the lowest word, and then ADC for each higher word. But because the HL register needs to be used for a 16-bit accumulator, you won't have easy access to it for indirect addressing, requiring you to use the bigger and slower index mode for pulling values out of memory. So doing a 32-bit addition may be faster with 4 8-bit additions rather than 2 16-bit additions, depending on how you need to access the data. To do a 16-bit subtraction with a single instruction, you'll need to use SBC, as sub is strictly 8-bit. Like a 16-bit ADC, the first operand must be HL, which is where the difference will be stored. The second operand can also be BC, DE, HL, or the stack pointer. Let's once again revisit a chaining example, this time for subtraction. We can use a single SBC to store the difference of BC minus DE in HL, but we have to do some special setup. Like with the 16-bit add, we need to first copy both bytes of BC to HL. But then we need to make sure that the carry bit is clear, as we have to use SBC for the 16-bit subtraction. One of the easiest ways to clear C is to simply do a compare of A to itself. Since CP does an internal subtraction, the carry flag is cleared as expected when the value of A is subtracted from itself. Now we can just do the SBC with HL and DE, and we're done. This only took 4 bytes of code, compared to 6 bytes for the chaining method. However, that space savings does not translate to time, as it actually takes a full 27 t-states to execute this code, 15 of them just for the SBC. Doing the chaining gets it done in only 24, so if time is a bigger constraint than memory space, you may want to opt for chaining instead. The effects of a 16-bit SBC are exactly what you would expect based on the behavior of 8-bit SBC. The one big exception is the H-bit, which will be in an undefined state just like the other 16-bit arithmetic opcodes. In fact, all SBC opcodes can set the S, Z, and PV bits, unlike the 16-bit add and ADC opcodes, which keeps those flags preserved. Now is a good time to come back around to the INC instruction, which we've been using already in our examples in this series. Of course, it adds 1 to the value in the operand and stores it in place. That operand could be any general-purpose register, and also the stack pointer, in case you want to manually pop a single byte off the stack. You can increment a single byte in memory by putting its address in HL, or an offset from that address in one of the index registers. The effects of INC are pretty much the same as add or ADC, except that the carry bit is left alone. It does not figure into the calculation, and for 8-bit increments the C flag is preserved, while all the rest behave the same way as any 8-bit addition. For a 16-bit increment, all flags are preserved, including the H and N bits, which are subject to change with add or ADC. We've seen even more of dec, which we have used extensively for decrementing loop indexes. You can use it to subtract 1 from all of the registers that are supported by INC, as well as indirect with HL and indexed addressing. As dec is a subtraction by 1, it has most of the same effects of sub or SBC. For an 8-bit decrement, the C flag is preserved, but all the other flags work the same as any other subtraction. All the flags are preserved for 16-bit decrements, even the Z flag, so you will need to test both bytes of a 16-bit register for 0 if you are using it as a loop index. We have just one more arithmetic instruction, neg, which negates the value in the accumulator. This means that it effectively subtracts the value from 0, reversing its sign while maintaining the same absolute value. Of course, this assumes that the value in A is a signed 8-bit integer. It affects the flags in the same way as a sub or SBC instruction doing the same effective operation, with N always getting set and the carry flag getting set when the original value in A is non-zero. One interesting thing about neg is that there are 8 different 2-byte opcodes for it, and they all behave the exact same way. Finally, we have made it to the example program. We're just going to do some math with the instructions that we've seen in this lesson, and see how they worked by printing out the contents of the registers after each arithmetic operation. Our code starts with the usual device, org, and jump, then gets into the constants and data we will need. First, we'll need the enter character code to handle printing new lines, as we've seen before. Then our only bit of data is a 16-bit word of scratch RAM that we will use for different things throughout the program. At start, we initialize A and the status flags by loading it with hex 10 and then adding 2, which will give us hex 12 in A and all flags cleared out. We then load up HL with hex 3, 4, 5, 6 just to keep our pattern going. A call to the print AFHL routine will print out the contents of A, F, and HL in hex, followed by a new line. We'll see how that works later. This should show us our expected initial values right on the screen. Next, we load hex 0E into D and add that to A. This will give us hex 20 in A and set the H flag, which we will see in the next call to print AFHL. Now we want to make use of that scratch word, so we load the address into HL and load hex 60 into the first byte. We then add that to A to get hex 80, which will set the S and PV bits due to the sign change and overflow. We'll see that when we call print AFHL along with the new address in HL, which should be hex 8003. Then we add H, which should contain hex 80 as the high byte of that address, to A, which should also be hex 80 at this point. This will result in another overflow that leaves A with a value of 0, and thus the Z bit set along with a carry flag, as the sum would actually be hex 100. We see all of this with another call to print AFHL. Then we increment A, which brings it back up to 1 and clears all the flags except for C, which is still set from the previous add. We'll see this with another call to print AFHL. Then we negate A, which will make it -1 or hex FF. This also sets the S, H, N, and C bits, as we will see with print AFHL. Next we load 3 into BC and subtract it from HL. As the carry flag was set, 4 will be subtracted from hex 8003, giving us hex 7FFF in HL, and an overflow condition due to the sign change. We'll see that H, P, V, and N were all set with another call to print AFHL. The carry flag is clear, so when we follow it up with subtracting HL from itself, HL will be 0. This will cause the Z and N flags to be set, as will be seen with one last call to print AFHL. And now our program is done, and we can return. Now let's take a look at exactly what print AFHL is doing. First, we push HL and AF onto the stack, so that the values are preserved. Then we call another routine called print hex, which will simply print the hexadecimal value of A. Since A is the first register we want to print, that makes it pretty simple. So we want to get the F register we pushed to the stack earlier. It's at the very top of the stack, so the stack pointer is still pointing to it. We can't just use SP for register indirect loading, so we will need to get that address moved to a register that can do it. One option is to use the scratch RAM we already have defined. We just load the stack pointer into that word, then into BC. Now we can do a register indirect and get those flags into A and call print hex to print them out as a hex byte. Next we want to print out HL in hex, so we first load H into A and then print it, and then do the same with L. Now we want a new line so that the next call will print on the line below. As we've seen before, we just need to load that enter code into A and call the ROM vector at hex 10. Now we can pop AF and HL back off the stack. In the opposite order we push them in so that the values go back to the right registers. Then we return from the routine with everything back to where it was. In print hex we save HL and AF on the stack again. Then we shift A to the right by 4 bits to get the upper nibble into the lower nibble, and backfilled with zeros using SRL. We'll get into all the different shifting instructions in a later video. Then we call yet another routine, print hex digit, which will print the character corresponding to the value of A. When that returns, we pop AF back off the stack and restore the original value of A. Then we clear out the upper nibble with a bitwise AND. This episode was already too long to get into logic instructions, so that will have to wait for a future episode too. Another call to print hex digit will print the character for that lower nibble. Then we can pop HL back off the stack and return. For print hex digit, we need to determine whether this hex digit will be a decimal numeral or a letter. So we compare it to hex A, and if the S bit is clear, that means the value in A is hex A or larger. A conditional jump to print letter will happen in this case. If the jump didn't happen, the S bit is set, meaning that the value is 9 or lower. So we just need to do a bitwise OR with hex 30 to get the numeral character. Then we jump unconditionally ahead to print char. At print letter, we only get here when we need to print a letter, so we add hex 37 to the value, and that will get us the letter we're looking for. For example, hex A plus hex 37 is hex 41, which is the character code for capital A. B through F will work in the same way. Then we continue on to print char, which we would have jumped to earlier if we did the OR to get the code. Either way, at this point we have the desired code in A, so we just print it out with an RST10 and return. And that's it for our code. All that's left is the SaveSNA macro to generate a snapshot named math.sna. To generate this, of course, we have a build script. We just call sjasm plus with the LST option to generate a machine code listing, and then pass it the name of our assembly file, math.asm. Now let's go to the terminal and run it. We run build.sh, and then do a directory listing, and see that the math.sna snapshot file is there. So let's load it into the emulator. We're using Fuse again, so we hit F3 and select math.sna and let it run. Now we can see the values we expected in each of the registers each time we called print AFHL. You can take my word for it, or go back to the code and take a closer look. Just remember that bits 5 and 3 of the F register are based on executed opcodes rather than the results of the operations, so you'll have to look around those to see that the other 6 bits were set as expected. And that's all we have for this episode. We'll have to cover bitwise logic in our next episode, as we just didn't have time here. This will help illuminate our path to doing more advanced math, including multiplication and division. In the linked GitHub repo, you'll find not only this code, but all of the code examples for each lesson, and all of the slides presented in this series. In the README, you'll also find links to some additional materials that can help explain what's going on and provide some needed background in case your programming experience is a bit limited. Please subscribe to my channel and click the bell to be notified when the next episode comes out. And please like this video if you learned anything, and let YouTube know that you want to see more tutorials like this. If you can't wait for the next episode to go public, join our Patreon community and see my videos ad-free as soon as they are uploaded, just like the people you see here. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.